The auction was on a Saturday in March of 1973. Scott Peterson stood at the edge of the crowd, watching an estate sale unfold. Old man Hendricks had died the previous month. No children, no family who wanted to farm. Everything was being sold off. Scott was 26 years old. He'd been working as a hired hand on his uncle's farm for 8 years, saving every penny he could. He had $12,000 in the bank. Not much, but it was enough for a down payment on land if he could find the right piece at the right price. The auctioneer moved through household items, farm tools, implements. Then they got to the tractors. 2 International Harvester Farmalls, a 1952 Super M and a 1956 Model 400, both showing their age, faded red paint, some rust. But Scott had worked on equipment like this his whole life. He could see past the cosmetics to what mattered. The engines were solid, the transmissions worked, the hydraulics functioned. The auctioneer started with the Super M. "All right, folks, 1952, Farmalls Super M runs good, needs some cosmetic work, but she's a worker. Who'll give me $2,000 to start?" Silence. "1,500? 1,000? Scott raised his hand. 500. The auctioneer looked at him. "Son, I need to start higher than that." "That's what it's worth to me." Someone in the crowd laughed, but no one else bid. "All right, 500. Do I hear 6? Silence. "Going once, twice." Sold to the young man for $500. The 1956 400 went the same way. Scott bid 600. No one counted. Sold. $1,100 for 2 tractors. Scott couldn't believe it. As he was filling out the paperwork, a man approached him. Mid-40s, well-dressed, John Deere hat and jacket. Scott recognized him. Gary Mitchell, sales manager from Mitchell's John Deere dealership in town. "You're Scott Peterson, right? Work for your uncle?" "That's right." "Can I give you some advice?" "Sure." Gary looked at the 2 Farmalls. "Those tractors are junk. They're 20 years old. Parts are getting harder to find. They're inefficient compared to modern equipment. You just wasted $1,100. Scott shrugged. "They run. They work. That's all I need. But that's not all you need if you want to be a real farmer. You need modern equipment, efficient equipment, equipment that can compete. Compete with who? With farmers who are doing it right. Look, I know you're young and you're trying to save money. I respect that. But there's a reason successful farmers buy new equipment. It's an investment. It pays for itself in productivity. And debt," Scott added. "It pays for itself in debt, too." Gary's smile tightened. "Smart financing is part of modern farming. You can't grow without it. I'm not interested in growing. I'm interested in owning. You'll never own anything farming with junk like this. In 5 years, those tractors will be dead, and you'll have nothing to show for it except wasted time." Scott looked at the 2 Farmalls sitting on the trailer he'd borrowed to haul them home. "We'll see." Gary shook his head. "You're making a mistake. But hey, when you're ready to get serious about farming, come see me. I'll set you up with equipment that'll actually make you money." He walked away. Scott drove home with 2 old Farmalls and a fire in his gut to prove that son of a bitch wrong. Before we go any further, I need you to understand what Scott Peterson was attempting. He wasn't just trying to farm with old equipment. He was trying to prove an entire philosophy, that you could build a farming operation without debt, without new equipment, and without doing what everyone said you had to do. If you want to know how 2 junk tractors helped a young farmer pay off 160 acres in 10 years, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about more than just tractors. Let me tell you about Scott's situation in 1973. He had $12,000 saved. He'd been looking at farmland for 2 years. Most pieces were out of his price range, but there was one property that kept coming back on the market, 160 acres about 8 miles from town. The land wasn't great, sandy soil, some low spots that flooded needed work. That's why it kept failing to sell. The asking price had dropped from $70,000 to $60,000 to $55,000. Scott made an offer, $50,000, $10,000 down. The remaining $40,000 financed over 20 years at 8% interest. The seller accepted. Monthly payment, $334. Scott moved onto the property in April of 1973. There was a small house, a barn that was falling apart. No machine shed, no grain bins, just raw land and potential. He had $2,000 left after the down payment and tractor purchase. That had to cover living expenses, seed, fuel, and any repairs until he could harvest a crop and sell it. His uncle thought he was insane. "Scott, you can't farm 160 acres with 2 ancient tractors and no money. You need equipment. You need capital. You need—" "I need to try," Scott interrupted. "If I fail, I fail, but I have to try." His uncle sighed. "You're going to work yourself to death." "Maybe. But it'll be my death on my land, not someone else's." Scott spent his first month fixing up the 2 Farmalls. The Super M needed a clutch, the 400 needed hydraulic seals, and an oil leak fixed. He did all the work himself in his uncle's shop. Parts cost him $300 total. By May, both tractors were running strong. He planted 80 acres of corn and 80 acres of soybeans. Used equipment he borrowed from his uncle, paid him back with labor later. All summer, Scott worked. Just him and the 2 Farmalls. The Super M pulled the cultivator. The 400 ran the mower and did odd jobs. They were slow compared to modern tractors. Scott's neighbors could cover in 2 days what took him 5. But he didn't care about speed. He cared about getting it done without borrowing money. He lived on almost nothing. No electricity in the house for the first 3 months. Couldn't afford to get it turned on. No phone. He cooked on a wood stove and heated with firewood he cut himself. People in town talked. "Poor kid's going to lose everything. He's farming like it's 1950. Those old tractors are going to break down and leave him stranded." Scott ignored them and kept working. Harvest came in October. His corn made 90 bushels per acre. Soybeans made 28. Not spectacular yields, but decent for first-year ground. He sold everything. Grain prices were okay that year. Not great, but okay. After all expenses, seed, fuel, fertilizer, repairs, Scott netted $8,000. He put $4,000 toward his land payment, 12 months paid in advance. The other $4,000 went into savings for next year's operating costs. He'd made it through year 1. Gary Mitchell heard about it at the co-op, heard that Scott had actually pulled off a crop with those old Farmalls. He drove out to Scott's place in November. Scott was in the barn doing maintenance on the Super M when Gary pulled up. "Heard you had a decent harvest," Gary said. "Did all right. With those old Farmalls. I'm surprised they lasted the season. They're doing fine." Gary looked around the property, at the shabby house, the leaning barn, the absence of any nice equipment or modern conveniences. "Scott, you can't live like this. You're 26 years old, living like a sharecropper from the Great Depression." "I'm living debt-free on my own land. Seems pretty good to me. But you could be doing so much more. If you upgraded your equipment, you could farm more efficiently, cover more ground, make more money, and take on debt I don't need." "Smart debt. That's what separates successful farmers from—" He gestured at Scott's setup. "This." Scott set down his wrench. "Gary, why do you care what I farm with?" "Because I hate seeing young farmers handicap themselves. You've got potential, but you're wasting it on some stubborn principle about avoiding debt." "It's not stubborn. It's smart. Every payment I don't have to make is money I keep. Every dollar I keep goes toward paying off this land faster. In 10 years, I'll own this place free and clear. Can your customers say that?" Gary didn't answer. "Didn't think so," Scott said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." Gary left. But Scott knew it wouldn't be the last time they'd have this conversation. Let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever been told you're doing it wrong when you're actually doing it right for you? Drop a comment, because Scott was about to spend 10 years being told he was crazy while quietly building something that made everyone else look foolish. Year 2 was harder than year 1. Drought hit in July. Scott's crops struggled. His corn made 60 bushels per acre instead of 90. Soybeans made 18 instead of 28. When he sold everything, he netted only $4,000. Just enough to make his land payment for the year, nothing left over for savings. He worked a winter job at the grain elevator to make ends meet. Came home and did maintenance on equipment. Lived on almost nothing. Year 3 was better. Good rain. Decent prices. He netted $9,000, put $5,000 toward his land payment, kept $4,000 for operating costs. He bought a grain drill at an auction for $400, spent a week rebuilding it. Now he didn't have to borrow equipment for planting wheat. Year 4 he added winter wheat to his rotation. 80 acres of wheat, 40 acres of corn, 40 acres of soybeans. The diversity helped with cash flow. He netted $11,000. He bought a small combine at an auction for $2,800. It was a 1960 International 101. Old, slow, but it worked. Now he could harvest his own grain instead of hiring it done. Gary Mitchell saw him at an auction that spring. "You're still farming with junk." "Yep." "How's that working out?" "I've made 4 years of land payments. Have you kept track of how many of your customers have made 4 years of equipment payments without refinancing?" Gary's face reddened. "That's different. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, I own more of my operation than most of them own of theirs." "You're living in poverty to prove a point. I'm living simply to build equity. There's a difference." Year 5 brought another challenge. Equipment breakdowns. The Super M threw a rod, required an engine rebuild. Scott did the work himself over 2 months, cost him $600 in parts, but he got it fixed, got it running, got back to work. That year he netted $8,000, still made his land payment. By year 6, people had stopped calling him crazy. They'd started calling him stubborn instead. Some respect crept into the skepticism. That Peterson kid is making it work somehow. Still farming with those old Farmalls, haven't broken down yet. Living like a hermit, but he's paying off his land. Year 7 was a turning point. Everything came together. Good weather, good prices, good yields. He netted $15,000. He paid off 2 years of land payments at once, put the rest in savings. His debt was down to $24,000. Year 8, another good year, netted $13,000, paid down another 2 years, debt $16,000. Year 9, he got lucky. Grain prices spiked. He netted $18,000, debt $7,000. And in year 10, 1983, exactly a decade after he bought those 2 Farmalls, Scott Peterson made his final land payment. 160 acres, paid off, free and clear, at age 36. He'd done it with 2 tractors that cost him $1,100 combined. With a combine he bought for $2,800. With implements he'd pieced together from auctions and rebuilt himself. Total equipment investment over 10 years, about $8,000. Compare that to farmers who'd financed new equipment, $60,000 to $80,000 in debt. Payments of $1,000 a month or more. Many of them still heavily leveraged 10 years later. Scott owned his land, owned his equipment, owed nothing to anyone. He drove into town the day after he made his final payment, walked into Mitchell's John Deere dealership, found Gary Mitchell at his desk. "Can I help you?" Gary asked. "Just wanted to let you know I paid off my land." Gary blinked. "Your 160 acres?" "Yep, 10 years, paid in full." "With those old Farmalls?" "With those old Farmalls." Gary leaned back in his chair. "How?" "Lived cheap, avoided debt, fixed things myself, didn't buy anything I didn't absolutely need, kept every dollar I could instead of sending it to banks and dealerships." But you could have made more money with better equipment. Maybe. Or maybe I would have been making payments for 20 years and still not owned anything. I'll take my way." Gary was quiet for a moment. Then, "I underestimated you. You underestimated what matters. It's not about having the newest equipment. It's about owning what you have." "Are you going to upgrade now? Now that you can afford it?" Scott smiled. "Why would I? The Super M and the 400 are still running, still working. As long as they last, I'll keep using them." He walked out, and Gary Mitchell sat at his desk, wondering how many of his customers would ever be able to say they owned their land free and clear. Scott farmed that land for another 32 years. The 1952 Super M ran until 2001, 49 years of service, before he finally retired it. The 1956 400 is still running as of last year, 68 years old and still working. He never bought a new tractor. Everything he added to his operation came from auctions, paid for in cash, rebuilt in his shop. He expanded slowly, bought an adjacent 80 acres in 1992, cash, paid off, bought another 120 in 1998, cash, paid off. By the time he retired in 2015 at age 68, Scott owned 360 acres free and clear, all equipment paid for, no debt anywhere in the operation. His nephew farms it now, following the same philosophy: old equipment, no debt, slow growth, smart decisions. And sitting in Scott's shed, maintained and functional, is that 1956 Farmalls 400. The tractor Gary Mitchell said was junk. The tractor that helped pay off 160 acres in 10 years. Scott sometimes sits on it just to remember what it felt like to be 26 years old, with everyone telling him he was crazy, and to remember how good it felt to prove them all wrong. I recently talked to Scott about those early years. "Did you ever doubt yourself?" I asked. "Every day," he said, "especially the first few years, when things broke down, when yields were bad. When I was living in a house with no electricity, eating beans for dinner, I'd think, Gary's right, I'm crazy, this isn't going to work." "What kept you going?" "Stubbornness, mostly. I'd made a commitment. I told myself I was going to prove it could be done, and I couldn't stand the thought of Gary Mitchell being right." He laughed. "Pride is a powerful motivator. But also, I believed in the math. I knew that every dollar I didn't spend on equipment payments was a dollar toward owning my land, and I knew that if I could just hold on long enough, the math would work out." "Did you expect it to take 10 years? I hoped for 10, planned for 20. When I made that final payment after exactly 10 years, I felt like I'd won the lottery." "What would you tell a young farmer today who's in the same position you were in?" Scott thought about that. "I'd tell them that new doesn't mean necessary, that debt isn't required, that you can build something real if you're willing to live below your means and work with what you have. But I'd also tell them it's not easy. It requires sacrifice, discipline, the ability to ignore everyone telling you you're doing it wrong. Is it worth it? Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, I own this. Completely. No bank has a claim. No dealer has a lien. It's mine. And that feeling, that security, is worth every hard year. So let me leave you with this. Right now, someone's telling you that you need to finance something, that you need to upgrade, that you need to take on debt to compete, that old equipment is junk and you're handicapping yourself by using it. But the John Deere dealer called him crazy for buying 2 old Farmalls. Told him he'd fail, told him he was wasting his money, told him he needed modern equipment to be a real farmer. 10 years later, Scott walked into that dealership and told the dealer he'd paid off his land with those same 2 junk tractors, while the dealer's customers were still making payments. Because Scott understood something the dealer couldn't see. Ownership beats payments every single time. If this story changed how you think about equipment, debt, and what it really means to build something, Do 3 things. First, subscribe for more stories about farmers who built empires with equipment everyone said was worthless. Second, drop a comment. What junk equipment have you used that worked better than everyone said it would? Third, share this with someone who's being told they need to upgrade when what they have is working fine. The dealer called him crazy for buying 2 old Farmalls. 10 years later, he paid off his land, and the dealer's customers are still making payments. That's the difference between being called crazy and being called smart. It just takes time to know which one you really are. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.